Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, will anything shift the dial in this presidential race? Hurricanes, lies, scandals, interviews. And we'll talk about the Harris campaign's communication strategy this week with Democrat advisor Tracy Sefl.
And we're going to bust some budget myths, including emergency FEMA funding, with Republican Brian Riedl.
But first this week, veteran journalist Bob Woodward has a new book coming out. It's called War, and it chronicles the Biden administration's struggles to contain conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, and Donald Trump's efforts to regain power. Woodward is pretty blunt in his conclusions about both Biden and Trump, writing that Biden and his team will be largely studied in history as an example of steady and purposeful leadership, while Donald Trump is not only the wrong man for the presidency, he is unfit to lead the country. So there. But the big bit of news to come out of the book was this.
As the COVID pandemic was raging and the government could not produce enough tests for the American people, then President Donald Trump secretly sent rare COVID test machines to Russia, to Vladimir Putin, for the dictator's personal use.
Woodward also writes that Putin warned Trump to keep the gift a secret in case it caused Trump political damage. And according to one of Woodward's sources, Trump and Putin have spoken at least 7 times since Trump lost the 2020 election, before and after Russia invaded Ukraine. But Trump denies everything.
So you haven't spoken to him since you left the White House?
No, I have not.
And the other thing he said is that you had provided some Abbott test machines to Putin back during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, false.
The Kremlin, though, has confirmed that COVID tests were sent to Putin. But as for those phone calls, the Kremlin says it's not true. Vice President Harris has seized on the story.
In the height of the pandemic, and remember, and your listeners will remember, people were dying by the hundreds.
Yeah.
Everybody was scrambling to get these kits, the tests, the COVID test kits.
Couldn't get them.
Couldn't get them.
Right.
Couldn't get them anywhere.
Right.
And this guy who is president of the United States is sending them to Russia, to a murderous dictator for his personal use?
And several new Harris attack ads have already hit the airwaves, including this one shared by Joe Biden's personal ex-Twitter account yesterday.
Trump will always choose Putin over the American people. And now we have evidence. A new report that he secretly sent Putin COVID tests while withholding them from sick and dying Americans.
So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
Who will Trump look out for in his second term?
I think I could have a very good relationship with President Putin. I'm not disavowing that he called me a genius.
It's not you.
Interesting framing of the story, Chaz, and it's a real head-scratcher as well, whether to believe this story, I guess, first of all, but also why Trump would have done it. And the fact that by Putin warning him to say, look, yeah, thanks very much for the COVID testing machine, this Abbott testing machine, but don't let anyone know because it'll be really damaging for you. It's almost like in that moment, Putin was turning a diplomatic gesture into a bit of compromat against Trump because he immediately had the power to let this be known.
Look, I mean, yeah, you're right, but I do think the first question to ask is it true? I mean, you quoted some news articles that have said at least 7 times that Trump called Putin. I've seen other news articles say as many as 7 times. That's an important distinction. As many as could mean any number less than 7.
Sure, yeah.
Like 0. But also the other thing you need to remember is that with Woodward, he has a track record of favouring his sources. Now, you've got to ask yourself, who are his sources for this book? I don't think Trump's one of his sources because he's bagging Trump out in a big way.
Trump refused to talk to him for this book. Woodward's one source is a Trump staffer who was at Mar-a-Lago, and Putin called on the phone and Trump said, oh, you better leave for this. I've got to talk to Vladimir. Okay. Sorry, Vladimir, just hang on a second. Yep, they're gone. That's kind of the story, but it's one source. It's a Woodward source. I mean, Bob Woodward isn't Bob Woodward through, just printing any old guff.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying he's made it up. I'm just saying that we need to be cognizant of that. Like, it's not gospel, right? No. That's the first thing. But let's say it's true, for the argument, for the sake of argument, let's say it's true. Like Russia has acknowledged the machine.
The machine part is true.
So we can assume that's true at the very least.
Would it be a problem if there is evidence that proves this, if somebody else comes forward, a disgruntled Trump staffer or whatever, to say, yeah, all the time that America was sending military aid to Ukraine to defend against a Russian invasion, and Trump was strangely sympathetic towards the Russian invaders, yeah, he and Vladimir were chatting away on a regular basis. I mean, is that enough to rekindle the whole, what's going on with those two?
I think it's a concern. I think it's a concern. I don't think it's a surprise, but I think it's a concern.
Yeah.
Like, as you say, that America was involved in the war, and Trump had no role to play at all. And it's bizarre, quite frankly. And let's not forget, he had a whole bunch of documents in his person, under his personal control at that point in time, some of which have gone missing.
Right.
And they have never been recovered. And so it's just not a great situation.
Yeah, and because this is a Bob Woodward book and he will be doing a series of interviews over the next few weeks, the book gets released in the United States next week, this doesn't go away. This is not a one-day story. This is something that Woodward will keep repeating these juicy bits from the book. Journalists will keep reporting on it. The attack ads will keep going out. So this could keep bubbling along, at least for the next 3 weeks until the election.
Sure, but I should also say, if we're going to talk about this, we should also refer to the bit about Joe Biden and Bibi Netanyahu, which has also been linked.
Not nearly as close as Putin and Trump, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah, no, they're not friends. But yeah, my takeaway from, essentially, there's been a number of passages quoted which suggest that essentially Joe Biden is just kind of Bibi Netanyahu's plaything. Bibi Netanyahu will do something, and then Biden will swear a lot, like a petulant teenager, and then Netanyahu will do something else that Biden tells him not to do, and then he'll swear some more. He seems to have it comes off from these passages, if they're true. Once again, we can't know if they're true. Right. But if they're true, I think Biden comes off as incredibly weak, which is obviously the main knock on him from Trump. So I don't know what your take on that is, but if these are true, and I don't feel great about these single source stories. But if they're true, then I don't think he looks great either.
Given that the conflict in Gaza has been going on now for just about a year, and that Biden and Harris and others have been calling for a ceasefire for at least 10 months, it clearly says that they are not exerting any influence over Netanyahu. And that Biden's strategy of holding Netanyahu close, literally hugging him, of course, in the early days, but continuing to supply support and weaponry and defences when Iran and Hezbollah and others attack Israel, the United States is a big part of their defences as well. So it does call into question Biden's entire strategy. That's an interesting part of his legacy. But speaking of media coverage, in the space of just a few days this week, Vice President Harris sat for a very traditional media interview, that with America's 60 Minutes. She also was interviewed on a late-night comedy show, a daytime chat show, a major satellite radio show, and the most popular podcast with younger American women. And it was on The View, which goes to air live each day. The VP was certainly feeling the love. They even played her campaign theme song as she came on set.
Please welcome back the next president of the United States.
Very positive vibes. Harris took the occasion to announce a new policy to provide in-home care for seniors through Medicare. But despite the very friendly sort of atmosphere, there were some tricky questions like this one.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
So that is quite awkward territory for Kamala Harris. She is still Joe Biden's vice president. She wants to remain loyal to him. She also wants to define herself as representing some degree of change for the future. But that question about whether she disagreed in the past, well, she had to admit that she wouldn't represent change, or she wouldn't have done anything different along the way.
Instant attack ad for Trump right there.
Absolutely. And Trump was literally playing that comment within hours at one of his own rallies. And then he launched into a quite gratuitous attack on Harris's questioner, Sonny Hostin.
I think the other one asking the question is dumber than Kamala, so that's like, she's a dummy. I watched her over the years. That is one dumb woman. Sorry. I'm sorry, women. She's a dummy.
Kind of interesting there to see Trump sort of almost pull himself back from insulting yet another woman of colour. He wrestled with it and then he went ahead and he said it anyway. Harris also spent more than an hour live this week on the rapidly mellowing erstwhile shock jock Howard Stern's radio show. And it was certainly a bit of a Trump pile-on. Take a look.
His former chief of staff, 2 secretaries of defense, his national security advisor, people who served with Donald Trump in the White House, have said he is unfit to be commander-in-chief and is dangerous. So the people who know him best have let us know. They've seen him. They've worked with him in the Oval Office, and they know he is dangerous and unfit to be president of the United States.
His own vice president isn't voting for him.
That's exactly right.
How could anyone justify any of this?
Arguably as powerful as Harris's attacks on Trump was Howard Stern saying, look, I used to quite enjoy spending time with Donald Trump. Trump was on Howard Stern's radio show dozens and dozens of times in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Howard said, look, I was at the guy's wedding. He was at my wedding. He should not be president. He's quite a good, fun guy. And that clearly needled Donald Trump because he hit back on social media.
He looked like a real fool, working so hard to make a totally incompetent, ill-equipped person look as good as possible, which wasn't very good.
So it's an interesting change in strategy after not doing interviews for weeks and weeks and weeks, suddenly flooding the zone this week.
About time. Honestly, I didn't want to be a broken record, but she should have been doing this a month ago. I think it was a good week for her. I think 60 Minutes, for instance, was one of the tougher interviews she's taken, but I thought she came out pretty well. And in fact, she cleared up some stuff which hadn't been cleared up before. Like, for instance, she's been needled for ages about her flip-flops. Since 2019, she's changed almost everything. And she finally came up with a reasonable explanation for it.
In the last 4 years, I have been Vice President of the United States. And I have been traveling our country. And I have been listening to folks and seeking what is possible in terms of common ground. I believe in building consensus. We are a diverse people, geographically, regionally, in terms of where we are in our backgrounds. And what the American people do want is that we have leaders who can build consensus, where we can figure out compromise and understand it's not a bad thing, as long as you don't compromise your values, to find common sense solutions. And that has been my approach.
So saying that she's changed all her positions because she's trying to build consensus for some kind of common sense solution, that makes sense. That's a reasonable response, which we haven't heard until now.
Yes.
From that clip we just played, though, you would have noticed that was quite a heavily edited answer, and the entire interview was quite heavily edited. People seem to be surprised by that. I mean, we edit all our interviews.
And 60 Minutes America as well, they'll often run it so it seems like an interview, and then 10 seconds into the start of the answer, the host comes in again with a voiceover to paraphrase what the person is saying, to kind of skip through this bit of waffle to get to this point or whatever. But she hasn't failed, she hasn't effectively answered these criticisms. And then the upshot comes again, or the audio comes back.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that because it depends what the purpose of the interview is.
As long as you're journalistically sound and not changing the meaning,
yeah,
and you're not removing awkward bits that would otherwise have people think, oh, this person didn't have a good answer.
Yeah, if you're just removing just waffle, which doesn't mean anything.
It's a waste of time, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Like, just to get to their actual answer. So I don't have a problem with that. Having said all this, while I am complimentary of her getting out there, I am shocked that she still doesn't have some basic answers down for the same questions she gets asked every time. Like that question you pointed to before from The View, which you said was an awkward question. She's received that question in every single interview. She should have an answer by now. Even after that, and by the way, to give her credit, she did directly after the answer say, one difference between me and Biden is I'm going to have a Republican in my cabinet.
Yeah.
But people don't play it because she didn't think of it till like a minute later.
Sure.
But she had another chance on Colbert later on that day. She asked the same question again. And once again, she had a sharp line, but then she just waffled for a minute while she gathered her thoughts before she finally started talking about policy. Have a look.
You are a member of the President's administration. Under a Harris administration, what would the major changes be, and what would stay the same?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm obviously not Joe Biden.
I noticed.
And so that would be one change
Yes.
in terms of...
Yes.
But also, I think it's important to say with, 28 days to go, I'm not Donald Trump. And so when we think about the significance of what this next generation of leadership looks like, were I to be elected president, it is about, frankly, I love the American people, and I believe in our country. I love that it is our character and nature to be an ambitious people. We have aspirations, we have dreams, we have incredible work ethic, and I just believe that we can create and build upon the success we've achieved in a way that we continue to grow opportunity, and in that way grow the strength of our nation. So for example, my economic policies, I think of it, and I've named it as creating an opportunity economy. So it's about things like investing in small businesses.
Okay, and then she finally got into talking about her policies. That's why 60 Minutes has edits, because of answers like that.
Right.
And sure, she should get out there, and that's great. But you get the same 5 questions in every single interview, Kamala.
Yeah.
Why don't you come up with some answers? I find it baffling that she still doesn't have basic answers for these very common questions.
Yeah, so the Sunny Hostin question was slightly different to that, in that she was asking, what would you have done, is there anything you would have done differently to what Joe Biden has done? As in, is there a decision that has been made in the last 3.5 years that you're not comfortable with? And the reason why that's such a hard question is Harris does not want to say, well, I objected to the decision to pull out of Afghanistan, for example, or whatever difference she might have had, because as soon as she says that, it says, but nobody listens to me because I'm only the vice president. So it is a very, very difficult question to answer honestly. And the honest answer is, look, I have a say, I'm a sounding board, I have input, but at the end of the day, Joe Biden's the president, there's only one president at a time, he makes the final decisions, and sometimes they were things that I wasn't sure about.
I take your point, if you're being honest. But if you're being a politician, it's so easy for her to say, rather than having a $5,000 tax cut for small business, I thought there should be a $50,000 tax cut for small business, which is what I'm offering. Just move right into our policies.
Right.
It's so easy to do.
All right, you should be a spin doctor. That's a pretty good answer. Well, for more on Kamala Harris's media strategy, what's working right now, maybe what's not working, we're joined by Tracy Sefl. She's a Democratic communications strategist. She's advised Hillary Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, and others. Tracy, thank you for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you, John.
What do you make of Kamala Harris's media strategy as a communications specialist? Do you think she is reaching the right programs and platforms she needs to reach to get to the voters she needs?
One thing that I give her campaign so much credit for is just how fresh her communications strategies across the board continue to be. And by that I mean doing the kinds of media outreach she's done in the past few days, whether it's a podcast with millions of listeners or popular late night television and the king of all media, Howard Stern's show. I mean, these are really smart places to go. The traditional media, as we think of it, I mean, you guys, let's face it, it's really changed over the years. And we need candidates like her to go where our voters are. And that's not the evening news where the family sits around the television together. You know, the world has changed, and her communications strategies feel fresh in that regard. I'd also point out she has a tremendous, large, and extremely dynamic network of surrogates who are all over the country and all over the media in support of her campaign. Then, of course, you have her spouse, and you have Tim Walz, and you have Gwen Walz, and they're all everywhere. It's quite something.
Tracy, Tim Walz seems to have been recruited off the back of his TV interviews as much as anything else. Yet since he became the nominee for vice president, he hasn't done so many TV interviews. Do you think he's being best used?
I think from what I know of people who are in the room with Tim, whether it's smaller fundraiser events or larger rallies, that his sweet spot is in front of voters. And so he's not being deployed to sit down and do all of the interviews with all of the national media. He's been active on local media, which has the important reach to those hard to reach voters. And he's been doing these events that have gotten tremendous positive buzz as well as tremendous positive press. So Tim's been busy, there's no doubt.
Well, what do you think of the Trump campaign's media strategy so far? They've also been talking to new media, doing plenty of podcasts. JD Vance has also been appearing on pretty much every news show on TV. What do you see as the main difference between the two campaigns' media strategies?
Importantly, Trump appears to only want to do conservative and right-leaning media. So yes, there may be a lot of podcasts and new media, but it's a very ideological, specific decision that he and his campaign have made regarding the interviews he will give. He has not agreed to do a town hall style debate with Kamala Harris on national television. And she's rightly called him out for that, saying, I'm ready, and why aren't you? JD Vance has certainly been, as you say, he's been all over the place. And in part, it's to try to obfuscate that we are not seeing Donald Trump in the traditional and mainstream outlets. When people are tuning in and seeing clips of his events, they're oftentimes watching his garbled delivery and his non sequiturs and his completely strange trains of thought. And that's something that the campaign surely is not eager to show off.
Well, I wonder though, Tracy, is there any point at all in Kamala Harris appearing on Stephen Colbert's Late Show? Colbert is very, very anti-Trump, very pro-Kamala Harris. Presumably so is his audience. Does that win her a single vote?
The Colbert interview provided very meme-able moments for the Harris campaign. We all know exactly what type of beer she drank on that show. And that's the kind of thing that's clippable and TikTokable and Instagrammable. And these are the kinds of things that bolster their ongoing communication strategies. Is she winning voters by doing so? Well, perhaps she is. I really don't think that everyone tuning in to a major television network is all of one party. This is true in other media outlets, but CBS is an institutional network in America, and it's certain that the viewership is diverse. And so in that regard, good for her, good to be there, good to show that she's got that kind of loose sense of humor and ability to have the quick-witted conversation that Colbert is very good at.
So if you were advising Vice President Kamala Harris on the style and substance of her communications in this final 3.5-week stretch to the election, what should she be doing more of or indeed less of?
Be happy if she could do less fundraising. That's my least favorite part of politics and a lot of people's least favorite part. Because she has such a sizable financial advantage, it's hopeful for me that she won't have to be out there shaking the hands and taking the checks. It's a miserable and inevitable part of our American presidential political campaign system, and it's no fun. So I hope that she can do less of that and more of the types of events and activities that showcase her breadth of understanding of the issues that Americans care about, and also her warmth and her compassion and her respect for all Americans. In the US right now, we have millions of people who are reeling from hurricanes, the disasters that have wiped out entire communities, people whose lives have been shattered by these hurricanes. You have Donald Trump spouting bizarre nonsense about what the Biden administration is trying to not do to help people, things that are patently false. And then you have Kamala Harris, who's involved in the briefings and has visited the scenes of the disaster. And she's saying, we will help all of you. This isn't, her being president is being president for everyone. That's a marked difference that she makes between herself and Donald Trump. To say that this is a night and day election is pretty accurate.
Finally, what do you think has been the greatest challenge facing Kamala Harris because she started her campaign so late? And has that challenge been successfully met?
The main challenge is surely in the back end of things. All of the operations, logistics, the systems, if you will, that were in place. Every email address, every domain name, every piece of campaign merchandise, you name it. The back end is where I am very, very aware of just how much people were scrambling and how hard people were working around the clock when she became the nominee. Also, putting together a really successful convention in such a short time is a Herculean feat, and the Democratic Party pulled it off. I'm here in Chicago where the convention was held, and it was the happiest I've seen Democrats in a long time. And the credit goes to her team for being able to really nose to the grindstone. We don't have time to mess around. Everybody's all hands on deck, and it's a 24/7 operation.
Tracy Sefl, thanks for having a fireside chat with us.
Thank you. Thank you both. It was my pleasure.
The worst fears that Hurricane Milton could bring massive damage and loss of life to the west coast of Florida seem not to have eventuated. Damage is widespread and people have died, but the worst-case scenario of a 3-metre storm surge wiping out Tampa Bay have not eventuated. As the water rolled into the bay, the easterly wind was pushing the surge back out of the bay, and it kind of counted each other out. So at the end of the day, it was just a whole lot of good luck. The double blow, though, of Helene and Milton has cost billions and billions of dollars, as well as hundreds of American lives. Just as concerning, the lies being peddled on social media, broadcast media, and from the mouths of the likes of Donald Trump himself. We talked on Planet America on Wednesday night this week about his falsehoods about FEMA being broke because they gave all their money to illegal immigrants, and the Democrats want the illegal immigrants to vote for them. And even this was telling, as Joe Biden was out there this week condemning Trump and others for their misinformation and lies. Look at the Fox News chyron underneath the president, which calls that White House spin.
Assertions have been made that property is being confiscated. That's simply not true. They're saying people impacted by these storms will receive $750 in cash and no more. That's simply not true. They're saying the money is needed for this crisis is being diverted to migrants. What a ridiculous thing to say. It's not true. Now the claims are getting even more bizarre. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman from Georgia, is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. We're controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous. It's got to stop.
I know that chyron was up already when he started talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, but I'd like to think that even Fox News agrees that it's not just spin to say the government is not controlling the weather and that it wasn't all a conspiracy to steal lithium from some mine like some people on Twitter seem to think.
Yeah, and look, there's every chance that that is one crazy conspiracy theory that goes even too far for Donald Trump.
He hasn't mentioned it.
He hasn't mentioned it yet, but he'll probably be out there saying, well, people are saying that governments are controlling these things. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene has the ear of the former president of the United States. I mean, she's not just a crazy congresswoman from Georgia. She is an influential figure within the MAGA movement. But what about the rest of the politics that played out this week? Because obviously this is happening in the middle of a presidential campaign where neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris really has any part to play in all of this except playing politics.
Yeah. Donald Trump tried to inject himself early on, and then I don't think that really worked out too well for him, and so he just stepped back and then just started criticising everyone else, which is probably the natural position to take.
Back to the Rust Belt.
That's right. Kamala Harris was in a slightly awkward position because she whenever she would try to inject herself at all, like by acting like she was part of the chain of command, be part of a conference call, telling people what they can do, try and make phone calls, people would go, hang on, you have nothing to do with this. You're the vice president. It's Joe Biden who's involved in this, not you. But then if she turns up on Call Her Daddy, the podcast, or if she has beer with Colbert, people go, how can you act like that at a time like this?
When lives are at risk.
Yeah, shouldn't be focusing on the hurricane. So she's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Yeah. But having said that, I thought she had a bad moment in my particular view. I'd like to know what your view is. There was a news story that broke a few days back which was suggested that she had tried to ring Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, for reasons I don't understand, and Ron DeSantis didn't take a call because he said it was just political. Now, Ron DeSantis, when that news story first broke, just batted it down. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Have a listen.
I'm not sure who they called. They didn't call me, and their characterization of it was something that they did. It wasn't anything that anybody in my office did in terms of saying that it was political.
Pretty businesslike. He didn't really want to have anything to do with it. Fine. But then Kamala Harris, who, as we've discussed, only does interviews when she actually wants to do an interview. She just happened upon an interviewer on the tarmac at an airport. That's probably the third, maybe fourth time she's done that in the last 4 months. And she has happened to have a question asked about this story, and she teed off.
People are in desperate need of support right now, and playing political games with this moment in these crisis situations, these are the height of emergency situations, is just utterly irresponsible, and it is selfish, and it is about political gamesmanship instead of doing the job that you took an oath to do, which is to put the people first.
Now, some have speculated that her campaign leaked this story in the first place to NBC, and so this was their plan to try and make something out of it. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that they tried to exploit it. And I don't think it came off well, because Ron DeSantis didn't want a piece of this until that moment. And then he took a huge bite out of it, about 3 times on Fox News.
My focus has not been on dealing with Kamala Harris. I saw the news report. I didn't know she tried to contact me. But I'd also say it's not about you, Kamala. Right. It's about the people of Florida. My focus is exactly where it should be. And I can tell you this. I've worked on these hurricanes under both President Trump and President Biden. Neither of them ever tried to politicize it. She has never called on any of the storms we've had since she's been vice president until apparently now. Why all of a sudden is she trying to parachute in and inject herself when she's never shown any interest in the past?
And then to make things even worse, we got Ron DeSantis now against Kamala Harris, both going hard at each other. And Joe Biden is asked about Ron DeSantis' conduct, and he seems to be great mates with Ron DeSantis now.
The governor of Florida has been cooperative. He said he's gotten all that he needs. I talked to him again yesterday, and I said, no, you're doing a great job. It's all being done well. We thank you for it. And I literally gave my personal phone number to call.
They're best buds. They're going to have sleepovers now. So I don't know if Kamala Harris planned this to be her big break in the hurricane season, or if she just tried to exploit the news. Either way, I think it backfired pretty badly on her, and I think it made her look not great. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it was America's first Vice President, John Adams, that described the office of the Vice Presidency as your irrelevancy. And there's nothing more irrelevant than a Vice President in the middle of a hurricane, which is basically a state response with federal ability to come in and say, here's $100 billion to aid your people. They open up the purse strings and they provide some material support as well. But it's basically a state thing. So no role for the Vice President to play, except the fact this is an audition for the presidency of the United States. Harris cannot make herself irrelevant. She has to look commanding, in control, knowing what's going on, even though she's not sending plane loads of pre-made meals and water bottles down to Florida. Ron DeSantis clearly, I mean, you know, look, two politicians accusing each other of playing politics, bit rich on both sides. Ron DeSantis, he knows from history that he can work with Joe Biden right now because Biden's not on the ballot in November. He does not want to be seen to work with Kamala Harris. Otherwise, he's Chris Christie in 2012 hugging Barack Obama after Superstorm Sandy, damaging Mitt Romney. Now, if DeSantis right now is not just praising Biden or saying no problems with Biden, and says, I've had a good conversation with Vice President Harris, that doesn't help Trump one little bit. So DeSantis is still thinking about how he works with Trump if he's elected, how he runs for the presidency again in 2028. No matter whether Trump's elected or not, he still needs Trump supporters to support him. It didn't work out in the primaries, but DeSantis is good in these situations. He was good after Hurricane Ian in 2022. That's when we were thinking, maybe this guy is a shot of beating Trump. Maybe this is a guy who could even be president someday. Ron DeSantis becomes a good commander-in-chief in a crisis like this. He's in control of the facts, but then he gets involved with that sort of politics. I found it clumsy on both sides, I must say.
Fair enough.
Now, on this week's Planet America, we heard briefly from the federal budget and spending policy expert Brian Riedl, who's worked for several Republican presidential campaigns. He was the lead architect of Mitt Romney's 10-year deficit reduction plan. How did that work out? Brian explained to us at the time why Donald Trump's claims about disaster relief money being spent on illegal immigrants by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, are completely false. And we took the opportunity of, when we're talking to Brian, to also ask him about the real funding problems affecting FEMA right now. And then we threw in a few extra questions about the spending and tax policies of both Trump and Harris. Here's what he had to say. I know, Brian, your expertise is on the budget side, but on the disaster response side, is that cynical budgeting having a real-world impact? Can we go so far as to say that the quality of response and indeed the ability to save lives and property is compromised as a result?
FEMA has a relatively spotted track record responding to emergencies. You know, people in the United States remember Hurricane Katrina very well about 20 years ago. FEMA's not always in the strongest suit. It's not necessarily because of a lack of funding, though. FEMA is usually funded at least pretty quickly after the disaster happens. But in the United States bureaucracy, there's always going to be some mismanagement. And FEMA historically has had a lot of mismanagement, even outside of its funding challenges.
You just referred to FEMA in the budget, but what other concerns are there, if any, about Congress never seeming to pass the annual budget on time?
Congress hasn't finished the appropriations bills by the October 1st deadline in decades. The result is they wait until about 2 days before Christmas and then take all of the year's bills, merge them all together into one $2 trillion bill funding everything for the whole year, and then give members of Congress 48 hours to read on it and vote on it with no amendments. This is part of the reason government grows and it's mismanaged. Congress falls behind on budgeting, then they have to do $2 trillion at the last minute before anybody reads it.
Brian, setting aside the idiocy of Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, saying that these storms are created and directed by who knows who. But what about the hypocrisy that is on show from those members of Congress, others that you see who are saying one thing now, that they need FEMA money for their districts in Florida, for example, compared to their previous votes and their previous statements?
Yeah, there's always a lot of hypocrisy to go around. There's members of Congress who vote against disaster aid funding when it's somewhere else, particularly if it's the other party's state or district, and then demand it when it's their district or state. While we're speaking of hypocrisy, President Trump is blaming President Biden for raiding the disaster relief fund. In 2019, it was actually President Trump who tried to raid the disaster relief fund to finance his own immigration policies right during the 2019 hurricane season. So Trump is accusing Biden of doing exactly what Trump himself did as president 5 years ago.
Is there anything else you want to get off your chest as a budget expert? The kind of things that are being said, particularly by the campaigns, about what they're going to do or the impact that it's going to have on the economy and so on. Are there anything that's really bugging you right now?
That's bugging me. Both candidates have been extraordinarily fiscally irresponsible, proposing to add roughly $7 trillion in deficits over the next decade, on top of $22 trillion in baseline deficits already projected into the system. That means we're looking at about $30 trillion in added red ink over the decade, whether it's Trump or Harris getting elected president. Additionally, while both candidates continue to run on bringing down prices and bringing down inflation, we continue to see proposals for tariffs, runaway spending, and other policies that are only going to raise prices further. It seems like the Santa Claus pandering of the Trump and Harris campaign is really designed to make deficits and inflation even worse, no matter if they promise the other way. It really is silly season and pandering season in Washington.
Now, Brian, a few months back, there were concerns that Kamala Harris is running a vibes-based campaign with not a lot of policy, but since then she has released an 82-page booklet with her economic plan. Is that enough detail now, in your view, to reasonably evaluate her policies? And how does her level of policy detail compare to Donald Trump's, in your view?
Harris has added more policy. She's filled in details, particularly in proposals like her price gouging idea that originally sounded like full-on price controls. The detail is appreciated, and at this point, I think she's reached a typical level of detail from presidential campaigns. Of course, Trump offers no detail at all. Trump proposals come and go with random asides and random speeches. No one really knows if he means it, if he's serious, if he's backing it up. The Trump campaign is entirely based on vibes. Harris has more detail. That being said, both candidates are still proposing generally irresponsible platforms that are gonna deepen the red ink.
It's interesting seeing that Brian is happy with the level of policy detail from Kamala Harris, because to be honest, I'm not. even like 2 days ago when she released that Medicare policy, part of it was, and we're going to increase the estate tax a certain amount. We'll get back to you on that. I just don't think it's good enough. You get, we need to know at least tax rates, like I would have thought. But anyway, having said that, I think what Brian said about fiscal responsibility is true. That Brian's pretty honest. He doesn't muck around. He's probably the most honest guy in Washington, to be honest. I think Kamala Harris is more fiscally responsible. At least her plan is more fiscally responsible than Trump's. If you have a look, she's spending more than Trump, but she's taxing a lot more as well. She's sunsetting Trump's tax cuts for the rich. She's raising corporate taxes from 21% up to 28%. She's raising capital gains taxes for the rich from 20% to 28%. She's raising income taxes for the rich from 37% to 39.6%. And there's a bit more as well. She's raising taxes, right? So that is fiscally responsible to at least raise more revenue. Right. Whereas Trump is all tax cuts and also giving tax breaks for Social Security payments, tax breaks for tips, which Kamala Harris is doing as well, for overtime payments. He's not raising nearly as much money on the tariffs as Kamala Harris is on taxes. Yep. So the net result of that is Penn Wharton, which is where Trump went to college, their model has Trump's policies costing $4.1 trillion to the economy versus Harris's $2 trillion to the economy. But if we're being honest, they're both being pretty irresponsible. Yeah. Like, it's just one's slightly less irresponsible than the other one in that they just put out the deficit just this week, $1.8 trillion. $1 trillion in interest payments. Like, that's more than the defense budget now, and it's only going up over the next little while. And what's driving that? Medicare and Social Security. What are we seeing during this campaign? Kamala Harris just announced this week that she's taking more money out of Medicare, so it's going to cost more. And Trump is giving tax breaks to Social Security, so that's going to cost more. So both of them are making the major fiscal problems that America is facing worse. Yeah. And neither of them are even countenancing the possibility of improving that situation. And I don't want to be boring about this, but America has a real debt problem. Yeah, it really does. Yeah, but we're in campaign promise season. Yeah. We're a long way from any of these things passing in Congress. So it's all kind of I guess magic money at this point. Look, before we go, let's take a quick look at how the polls are shaping up this week. And there has been a slight tightening in the average of national polls. Harris is still around 2.5 percentage points in front. Trump did come out on top in a national poll from ActiVote yesterday. Only the second time he's won a national poll in the last month. So this could be a margin of error thing, or maybe a sign of a bit of a shift. The swing state averages very much on a knife edge, much closer to the national picture. Harris leading by 1 point in Pennsylvania, 1 in Wisconsin, Michigan and Nevada. Trump leads by 1 in Georgia and North Carolina, and almost 1.5 points now in the state of Arizona. Now,
If those polls were exactly right, Harris would have just won an election held this week. It would have been very, very close. But remember, polls in both 2016 and 2020 underestimated Trump's support. On the other hand, I guess the midterm polls in 2022 underestimated the Democrats' support. So, flip of a coin.
Yeah, it just couldn't be more tight. Honestly, Harry Anton on CNN put it really well this week, I thought.
How much do the state poll averages miss by, all right? The average error since 1972 in the close races in those battleground states we've been looking at, 3.4 points. 3.4 points. Every single state, all 7 of those key battleground states are within 3.4 points. What's the chance for an even larger error? You know, we talk about the margin of error, right? So what is that 95% confidence interval? What is that true margin of error? 5% of errors in state polling averages are off by more than 9.4 points. These battleground states are well within that. I want you to remember this number because the bottom line is this race is going to be too close to call almost certainly all the way till Election Day.
That's pretty tight.
Very.
Every single swing state within the average margin of error for the last 50 years. But in particular, I want to draw your attention to Michigan, which Kamala Harris can win without Michigan, but won't win without Michigan. Realistically speaking, that's become so tight. She's been ahead in Michigan for a few weeks now, sometimes by 3 points. Trump is really making ground there. And if you don't believe me, just listen to the Democrat Senate nominee, Elise Slotkin.
I'm not feeling my best right now about where we are on Kamala Harris in a place like Michigan right now. We have her underwater in our poll.
Yeah, she didn't think that was going to get leaked, I don't think.
Right.
And that's, it's pretty tight. In particular, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point in time, the fact that all the polls suggest that Harris is really doing poorly amongst the Arab American vote in Michigan, which is costing her at least a point.
Yeah, they're not going to vote for Trump. They're just going to stay at home.
Yeah. And on top of that, she's not doing so great in the youth vote either, and Michigan is a particularly young vote. In fact, it was the youngest vote in 2022, had the largest proportion of youth turnout in 2022, and she's doing better than Trump, a lot better than Trump, but not nearly as well as 2020, Biden in 2020. That's
and
the
she's
problem.
not doing as well amongst white working class men as Joe Biden was doing, which won him the Rust Belt in 2020.
Talking about which, Trump hasn't even begun advertising, or hadn't begun advertising until quite recently. And he's running so big on exactly that demographic, the white working class, the union demographic. This is his ad in Michigan that's getting played constantly.
Attention auto workers. Kamala Harris wants to end all gas-powered cars. Crazy but true. Harris's push requiring electric only is failing big. And Michigan auto workers are paying the price. Massive layoffs already started. You could be next. President Trump's committed to protecting America's auto workers, standing up to China's unfair trade, fixing the economy, and ending inflation.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Whatever you think of that message, or whether you think it's true or not, it's working.
Yeah.
It's getting real tight in Michigan.
Yeah, and Trump's ad makers are certainly a lot more disciplined in their message than Trump himself. Earlier today, he was speaking in Detroit, and he warned the people in attendance that if Kamala Harris wins, all of America is going to end up like Detroit, which wasn't really much of a compliment for Detroit. They're just going to hope that he stays quiet and we let the ads do the talking. But, of course, we also learnt this week that Kamala Harris has passed $1 billion in campaign earnings in 3 months since she entered this race. And for the first time, that was not a number that they wanted to put out there to make people excited. They don't want people to say, oh, well, she's got $1 billion. I don't need to donate, because they are spending that money. They're bolting this plane together, not just on the tarmac, but at 15,000 feet.
They are definitely spending this money. And until now, Kamala Harris hasn't been running negative ads. She's been running introductory ads for herself because she needs to do that because she started so late.
Yeah.
This week, she announced negative ads are starting. So At bigger than dollars, there's a lot of negative ads, John.
Yeah, this is the championship quarter. It's there for either side to win. It's going to be a heck of a race. That's it for another Fireside Chat. Planet America is back at the new earlier time of 9 p.m. on Wednesday night on ABC TV, or any time after that you like on iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And we have another Fireside Chat next week as well. And if that's not enough American politics, there is, of course, the PEP podcast.
Oh, yeah.
That's enough.
All right.
Right there. See you there. Bye-bye.